Hello, everyone, and welcome to the webcast. I'm Emma Graney, the energy reporter with the Globe and Mail, and I am pleased to be your host and moderator today. Before we get started, in the spirit of reconciliation, I am coming to you from Calgary, where we live, work, and play on the traditional territories of the peoples of the Treaty 7 Nation and the Métis Nation of Alberta. And we're grateful to have the opportunity to work and live on this unceded land and listen and learn from Indigenous communities and leaders as we work together toward a sustainable future, which is a big part of what this is all about today. The Globe is actually presenting today's event with support from FortisBC, and we are pleased to actually have a representative of Fortis on our program today, along with a bunch of other speakers who are joining us independently. So over the next hour, as I'm sure you're aware because you did sign up for this, we're going to be talking about hydrogen energy and the role it might play in Canada's shift to the clean economy. Now, we do have an awesome group to address this important topic today. I'm really excited to get into it. So as we go along, if anything pops into your head, please do ask questions and post comments. We will get to some of those at the end, and I love having audience participation. So you can do that using the Q&A box on the right of your screen. For now, though, let's introduce our panelists who are joining us today. First of all, we've got Dana Wong, who is a Senior Manager of Renewable and Low Carbon Fuel Strategy with FortisBC in beautiful Vancouver. Next, we have Hoda Taliban, a Senior Energy Transition Consultant with WSB. Hoda is also joining us from Vancouver. Also here today, we've got Chief Billy Moran, who is the Board Director of Edmonton Global. Billy is a former Chief of Enoch Cree Nation in Alberta, an absolutely beautiful part of the world. Good to see you again, Billy. And last but not least, we have Trevor Van Egmond, Senior Manager of Industry Advancement with the Alberta Motor Transport Association. And he's joining us from Rocky View County. So we're a big West Coast contingent out here, which is lovely to see. Thanks for being here, everyone, today. I really do appreciate it, and I'm sure our audience do too. So let's get started with the questions. We got, as you know, as for the audience, some of you might be a little bit new to hydrogen. Some come up with an awful lot of knowledge. So hopefully we're going to hit a happy medium here in terms of what we're talking about. But Dana, I wanted to start with you. So now you work with FortisBC, and it's a utility that's quite involved with hydrogen, right? So for those in the audience who aren't familiar with hydrogen energy or a little less familiar potentially, can you just explain it briefly?
Sure, of course. So hydrogen is the most abundant element in the universe. It's the simplest and the smallest element in the periodic table, but it's almost always found as part of a compound. Water, for example, it's hydrogen and oxygen. And to use hydrogen as a clean fuel or a clean energy carrier, it has to be manufactured into its pure form. And there's many different production technologies that use a variety of resources to do that, like natural gas, nuclear power, and renewable energy like solar and wind. Now, what's notable about hydrogen, though, is that it produces no greenhouse gas emissions when it's consumed. It only generates water. And that's important because it can be used to displace higher carbon fuels in a range of applications, from transportation, heating, and power generation. So hydrogen has a huge potential as a clean energy solution.
Yeah, for sure. It seems to be drawing that kind of clean energy gaze all around the world as the world kind of seeks to decarbonize. And I'm just going to stay with you for a moment here because you're giving us some very good basic explanation.
Sure.
We do hear about, and I know some people hate the colors, but we do hear about blue, green, gray, even turquoise, I've heard, which is a beautiful color. Don't know how it works for hydrogen, but can you just give us a very top line explanation of how they differ? Because we do see this when that discussion is around hydrogen.
Yes. So all the different colors simply refer to the production process or the way that the hydrogen is made. Gray hydrogen is the way in which most hydrogen is produced today, and that's made from natural gas. However, it produces carbon emissions vented to the atmosphere, which isn't great from a climate perspective. And why hydrogen has gained a lot of traction lately is that there are other lower carbon production methods, such as blue and turquoise, like you mentioned, which also use natural gas, but with much lower carbon intensity. So with blue hydrogen, carbon capture and storage technology is used to capture those carbon emissions and safely store them underground. With turquoise, it's also made using methane as a feedstock, but carbon is captured in solid form, which can then be used for other applications. Green hydrogen refers to renewable electricity that is used to split water molecules into oxygen and hydrogen. But I do want to say, Emma, that it's not, the colors might be useful in general terms, but the important differentiator isn't actually the color, but the carbon intensity of that manufacturing process. So it's possible to be misled into thinking that one color might be better or worse than another. There's even variations within the colors. But from a climate benefit standpoint, we need to focus on the life cycle carbon intensity of production, not the color.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point, and I know that's a bit of a bugaboo for some folks that I speak with who are very involved in hydrogen. That emissions intensity is so important when we're talking about decarbonizing, right? So, Trevor, I'd like to come to you next because when we're talking about decarbonisation, transportation obviously represents a sizable chunk of Canada's greenhouse gas emissions. So I understand there are some hydrogen pilot projects that you're working on with the Alberta Motor Transport Association, which sounds pretty cool.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Emma. Yeah, we have a number of hydrogen-based projects. Our goal is to demonstrate to our members that zero emission technologies is viable in Canada, and you can't get adoption of these vehicles without actually trying them out first. So AMTA is the project lead in building the first two heavy-duty hydrogen fuel cell electric trucks in Canada. They can pull Canadian weights. The idea of these trucks is that they can pull loads long haul, 700 kilometers on a full tank of hydrogen. We actually just reached a major milestone with this project where the trucks are all put together. They arrived at a closed circuit track in Quebec for commissioning. So we're getting our first hydrogen fill into these trucks actually tomorrow. So it's quite exciting. The idea of using these trucks, once they're proven on a closed circuit track, proven for safety and quality, we're going to get them over to Alberta, and they're going to do long haul routes from Edmonton, Calgary return on a single tank of fuel. We're going to prove over 18 months of data collection that this technology works. So part of these projects, we're also building Western Canada's first truck fueling station for hydrogen, which is going to fuel these trucks because you can't run hydrogen powered trucks without hydrogen. It just doesn't make sense. The commissioning of that plant with our project partners Suncor and HTEC is actually going to be commissioned on June 7th, so next week. So everything's kind of happening now where these demonstrations and these pilots are just starting out. The other project that we're working on is the hydrogen vehicle demonstration. So we brought up a couple trucks from the States. They're hydrogen fuel cell electric trucks. We've had the Heisen truck in our possession since December, and the AMTA proctors short-term leases with our members. So our members actually have the opportunity to try out these different Class 8 trucks in their own fleets, pulling their own freight for a couple of weeks at a time, and we rotate them through the 60 different applicants who've signed up to be a part of this demonstration. We also have a Nikola truck, hydrogen fuel cell electric truck that's arriving in September, and same concept. We're going to get our members to try it before they buy it. We've also included in these demonstrations a hydrogen diesel dual fuel. So it's a conversion kit that connects to an existing truck, displaces 25 to 50% of the emissions, and we're working with the University of Alberta to validate that through putting some sensors and some tracking computers onto the truck, and we're going to be able to validate the emission savings that happen. So our members are going to be able to look at a low-cost solution in converting their existing trucks to hydrogen diesel dual fuel, kind of like a hybrid. It just shoots diesel in on top of the air take into the fuel chamber and displaces the diesel. So we have a couple projects going on, and it's actually quite exciting.
Yeah, that's really neat. And as you say, like there's a lot happening right now in disparate kind of parts of things. But overall, when you combine these different trials and the projects and what you're coming up with in terms of these the work you're doing with the university as well, like more broadly, what do you hope to see there in terms of changes for the transportation industry or even future plans down the road?
Well, we're at the early stages of adopting zero emissions technology in commercial transportation, and it needs to start with a demonstration. So we're at the pilot stage where we're taking these prototype trucks and we're trialing them out. We're building a couple of our own to demonstrate that they actually do work, pulling Canadian weights, which is 142,000 pounds. The trucks that I talked about that came up from the States, those only pull 82,000 pounds. So Canada is a different sort of market longer distances, longer ranges, need to carry more freight to make it more economical. Our goal is to demonstrate that these technologies actually work, and that we can apply them into a Canadian setting, and they could deal with the minus 30s in Alberta and across Canada. So AMTA is agnostic to the different types of technologies. We want to try them all out. We want to be able to create some report cards and work with our counterparts at the universities to collect all the data and be able to report it back to our members. We'll be updating our website with the trials from the hydrogen vehicle demonstration in the coming weeks, just as we get more data coming in from our members.
Yeah, I'm from Australia, and I don't think that -30 is something that our long haul trucks really have to deal with that much down there. Actually, Hoda, this brings me to you. There's something I do want to ask you. You know, we've just talked there about transportation, but part of the challenge with energy sources is figuring out where they are best applied. So we just, heard there from Trevor about how it can work in transport. What are some other uses that you see as being a really good fit for hydrogen? And also, sorry for getting your last name. I think I didn't do a very good job there. Apologies.
No worries. Hydrogen is currently being used as a feedstock in like oil refining, ammonia, methanol production, steel production in Canada. But this hydrogen is produced from fossil fuels without carbon capture. So one of the immediate markets that can scale up low carbon hydrogen is basically it's using it as a feedstock, like the current market that hydrogen already has in Canada. The new application for hydrogen, as Trevor was like mentioning, is using it as a fuel, because hydrogen we know that it's a chemical energy carrier, and it's best fit for energy intensive application where it offers like advantages over direct electrification. So this market includes aviation, shipping, high temperature industrial heat, as Trevor was mentioning, long distance and long haul road transport. Hydrogen also can provide heat for buildings. But another interesting application that I see for hydrogen is using it for long-term, large-scale energy storage, because we know that wind and solar energy, they have intermittent character. So as the share of these renewables increases in the grid, the role of electricity storage becomes more significant to ensure the reliable and stable grid, and hydrogen can contribute to this. Instead of curtailing the wind and solar energy when they are producing excess electricity, this electricity can be converted into hydrogen through electrolysis and stored for later use. Basically, I can say that hydrogen facilitates even integrating larger amount of intermittent renewable energy into Canada's grid. And even if we don't want to basically convert hydrogen back to electricity, like all this hydrogen back to electricity, we can direct it into different markets. We can produce green ammonia. We can power semi-truck with the clean electricity that otherwise would have been wasted, would have been curtailed, basically.
Yeah, and you know what? I'll just come back to you in a second here, Hoda, on the flip side of that. But Dana, I think you had a thought there about what Hoda was just saying, yeah?
Yeah, Hoda, it's funny you mentioned about energy storage, because sometimes we think of our gas distribution system as just a massive battery for all that excess renewable energy that can be generated.
Yeah, true. Actually, this is like as I mentioned, like hydrogen is a good complement to all these resources.
Yeah, and so on the flip side, then, what are some of the limitations of hydrogen? Because sometimes you mention hydrogen, people go, "Oh, things blow up," So, what are the limitations? Because there are some. We have to come into this conversation honestly, I think.
Yeah, I can provide some examples on the market. In theory, hydrogen can be used to decarbonize almost every sector, but just because it can, it doesn't mean that it would eventually dominate like every market. As it's reflected in many hydrogen roadmaps, hydrogen should be prioritized for applications where direct electrification is not practical. For instance, like light duty transportation, battery electric vehicles, we know that they offer a higher efficiency option, and they will eventually dominate those markets that have like the charging infrastructure is like very widespread. It's like available and accessible to everyone, and also those markets that have strong low carbon grid infrastructure. Or another example is heat pumps. They are also promising solutions for building heating, especially in regions with milder climates and those regions that have access to a low carbon grid. Or other market that hydrogen may have some challenges to penetrate is industrial processes where high grade heat is not basically required. So electric resistance heating, electric boilers, electric furnaces, they have higher efficiency and they come at a lower cost if low carbon electricity is available in that market. So there are some market limitations as well, but this doesn't mean that hydrogen cannot penetrate to those markets. Maybe in some climates, in some regions, there are like other, solutions that are also accessible.
Yeah, and it's funny because the International Energy Agency, you make a really relevant point because they say if we're going to decarbonize, we kind of need all tools at the table, right? We need everything
Yes.
that we can get. Trevor, you had something to add to that too, mate, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. Hoda is spot on in her comments. We're going to need the battery electric vehicles just as much as we're going to need hydrogen fuel cell electric or hydrogen powered vehicles. The hydrogen is going to help look after the long range, traveling more than 700 kilometers, where the battery electric is essentially going to be back to base deliveries or going from the warehouse to the store. And it makes a lot of sense. And AMTA is testing out battery electric as well as hydrogen.
Yeah, there's certainly a lot of things that we need to kind of all rely on, I think, as we try and transition. Chief Moran, I want to throw over to you. You're the former chief of Enoch Cree Nation, and you're also a board director with Edmonton Global. For those who are not aware, it's a foreign direct investment organisation. But I know that hydrogen is a really important conversation for Indigenous communities, given that they're, one of Canada's largest holders of energy assets. So what opportunities do you see for hydrogen and Indigenous communities? And does this come up in conversations a lot?
It's still relatively new, Emma, but for me personally, I think it's the most exciting new industry for First Nations to get involved in. Quite frankly, here in the Edmonton region, we have the Hydrogen Hub, and it's where the largest scale investments in hydrogen are coming. $1 billion plus from Air Products, foreign investment. We have Dow Chemicals coming in with Linde. And as Dana said, and a few others have said, we have already had traditional hydrogen development within the industrial sector here for oil and gas for a long, long, long time. And for Indigenous communities, for the last decades, we never ever seen ourselves in that industrial heartland. That's what Edmonton's known for. But with clean energy, with kind of the slate clean in terms of some of the recent developments over the last decade with free, prior, informed consent from UNDRIP, some of that reconciliation, economic reconciliation, societal aspects that we live in now. This is such a great opportunity for Indigenous communities to go in. And, for those who don't know how Indigenous communities work, you can compare us. I'll get in trouble a little bit from some of my other communities of comparing us to a municipality. And I think that's a fair comparison, but it's not a completely fair comparison because, municipalities do regulatory, they lobby other levels of government. We do all that as First Nations too, lock, stock, and barrel with those local municipalities on the Hydrogen Hub, which is so great because they're involving us early. But the other thing that we can categorize us as is large family businesses. And so we have the ability to directly invest in these projects and lower risk for those investments from foreign companies. And so I get really, really excited when, we've been on the sidelines for decades in the industrial heartland with the refining going out there, that hydrogen and the new investments there, they're now knocking on our door saying, can you co-invest with us? And these are not small investments. These are Alberta Indigenous Opportunities Corporation $1 billion backstop loans for First Nations communities to invest in net zero projects. So, attracting foreign investment and complementing it with the Indigenous communities out here, I think it goes against some of the notions out there that Indigenous communities are against all development or some level of development. This is all, it checks all the boxes for clean energy. It checks all the boxes for investment from internal to Alberta, Canada, and foreign direct investments. And it's just a win-win for everybody. So I get really, really excited in the early days of hydrogen.
So, you talk there about, this kind of cleaner energy part of this whole conversation. So a big part of that when it comes to hydrogen, obviously, is carbon capture, whereby, emissions are captured and stored underground or solely and turned into other kind of products. So how, with carbon capture and storage, how does that work and what are the opportunities there up in the Edmonton, in the Heartland region, Alberta's industrial heartland, and also for Indigenous communities?
Yeah, carbon capture and storage, quite frankly, probably Hoda or Dana can say it better than me, but for the layman's term, I think everybody kind of gets it, is you don't release carbon into the air, you capture it and you store it underground. I mean, that's the gist of it. And it's kind of the catalyst, I would say, for our first initial participation into hydrogen. And so the Alberta government has awarded pore space for further carbon capture investments from private sector. And what they did was they scored those awards to private companies based on some of their partnerships with Indigenous communities. So again, I love that government is realizing that there's participation from the Indigenous communities that's going to be relevant here. And we won 2 actual pore space awards with the multiple communities that I help represent, even in my new capacity as a former chief. And so those ones are not small investments. Those are looking at, for Capital Power, this is public news, they're switching from coal to natural gas, and they're going to attach carbon capture utilization to it. And their carbon capture utilization investment is actually bigger than their repower generating from coal, but it's going to lower carbon intensity in Alberta that much more. And then you got big things like Dow Chemicals, which is the largest investment in Alberta in decades of $10 billion plus. And that also has carbon capture utilization and storage. And so they're bringing in Lindy to do that. That was announced. And then the big one that's kind of already under construction, so people are already taking these investment risks, is Air Products. And their carbon is actually going to one of our pore space awards, which is Wolf Whitecap. So, it's the catalyst to get us in the door, carbon capture utilization and storage. It again kind of, you got the federal government, the provincial government, the local municipal governments, and private sector saying we need to do this to lower carbon intensity in Alberta, which is really, really great here for natural gas and things of that nature. And so again, it checks all the boxes in terms of going forward for those communities that I help represent. And we're at the table, not only at the board level, but also at the sub levels of, where can we go? Is it trucking with Trevor? And that's really cool about the Indigenous communities, is we can be at the equity table, but we can go anywhere and plug ourselves in the value chain, and things are looking great in that regard.
Nice. And I also like trucking with Trevor. I feel like that would be a really good children's something that we should all get behind. Dana, given that Chief Moran did name check you there in terms of hydrogen production methods, what are the most promising hydrogen production methods that you're coming across in your role there at Fortis?
Well, to be honest, I think that any of the low carbon and renewable production methods are promising, because there's a role for each one. No single low carbon energy solution is going to be able to address the entirety of demand. And also, we're going to need to use different technologies regionally according to the local resource base. But with that being said, I have to say that FortisBC is particularly excited for some advancements in turquoise hydrogen, or that methane pyrolysis technologies. And with the provincial government support, we've teamed up with Suncor Energy and Hazer Group on a pilot methane pyrolysis project to deploy a first-in-kind technology in North America. So with this process, we will be using renewable electricity to drive the production process, whereby methane will be split apart into hydrogen and carbon, which will then come off the production process as a high-quality carbon graphite. So that's a value-added product that can then be used in manufacturing or for industrial use. And so the key benefit of this technology is that it can be widely used in areas where there's no underground carbon storage. And that's really helpful when considering siting these projects. And some other benefits include that the electricity and the water needs for production are relatively lower than for green hydrogen or electrolytic hydrogen. And it can also be significantly cheaper to produce. Oh, Emma, you're on mute.
Yeah, look at me go. How many years into this and I'm still hitting mute? Sorry, I've got a bit of a cough, so I try and go a bit quiet here. But one part of the discussion around hydrogen is creating the market, all right? Like creating a demand for it. Like what activities are required before we can start using hydrogen on a larger scale, or we will start using hydrogen, or however you want to phrase that question?
That's a really good question. So there's a number of enabling activities that FortisBC is undertaking to introduce and scale the use of hydrogen in the natural gas system. And those activities involve developing standards and procedures, looking at end-use impact studies, and extensively analyzing the potential effects on the existing gas system. So we've partnered with the province and Enbridge and Pacific Northern Gas to assess BC's entire gas system, And on that note, we also need to form partnerships and collaborate with our industry peers, technical regulators, standards organizations, and academia to identify any knowledge gaps and extensively study and test hydrogen-enriched natural gas blends. On that note, in 2020, FortisBC announced a partnership and investment with the UBC Okanagan UBC Okanagan campus for a dedicated hydrogen lab, which is going to be testing hydrogen blending and helping us to understand the best practices of how exactly to use hydrogen in our system safely and effectively. And then finally, I will make a note that in BC, we don't have a lot of hydrogen production and use today. So we do have to build demand to help achieve scale for the industry. And we're doing that by getting our distribution system ready for hydrogen blending, as well as working with large gas users like industrial customers, and of course the transportation sector to use hydrogen using medium and heavy duty fleets.
Yeah, I know that hydrogen blending is already happening out here in Alberta too. And interestingly enough, as a side note, fun fact, I was down in Australia in the summer, and down there in Western Australia, they're really piloting this kind of stuff too. So it is happening all over the world, right? Not just in BC, not just in Alberta, not just even in Canada. This is really a global movement. But Trevor, I want to throw to you because fueling infrastructure is something that will, obviously be a big part of it, as you pointed out, kind of a hydrogen truck without hydrogen. So, that fueling infrastructure and supply is really important to trucking companies who might be weighing the opportunity to switch to hydrogen, perhaps. So what do you reckon? Like, what are your views on the current infrastructure for hydrogen fuel? And how do you think it might need to be built out? Obviously, we're still early on, but give you your magic wand. Trevor's Trucks builds hydrogen fuel and infrastructure. What would you like to see?
Well, really, we'd like to see a small corridor grow into a large corridor. One that goes, north south, in Alberta, and then east west across to BC and into the Prairie provinces. What that looks like is still up in the air. We are scoping out a couple different projects with some, with a multitude of project partners to determine what's the best technology to make this hydrogen. How do we avoid transporting it to reduce the cost? So when a truck pulls up to the pump, the price isn't going to be a ridiculous amount for the price of hydrogen, because our carrier members will not adopt a fuel that is 5 times the price of diesel. They want something that's very similar or even below the price of, the current diesel prices. So there's a lot of challenges to build up the infrastructure and help to foster the demand at the same time. AMTA is trying to do its part to demo these trucks to show that they do work. We need to build fuel stability and fuel infrastructure with stable pricing for our members to adopt hydrogen as an alternative fuel in commercial transportation.
And just to highlight a little bit about Trevor, and just to build on what he's saying, is his company's catalyst for this, and behind me is the H2 5,000 vehicle announcement. So it's heavy trucking, but it's also, again, the municipalities with public service vehicles. It's the airports with some of the transportation infrastructure they have there, and of course private sector with Trevor. So the goal in the hydrogen hub this past year with Canada's biggest hydrogen convention, 70 countries attended a month ago in Edmonton, was 5,000 vehicles in the next five years or so, give or take, of hydrogen. So it's momentum's there, and there's backing across all sectors.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Thanks for pointing that out. Yeah, that was a massive announcement up there in Edmonton recently, Billy. Hey, it's interesting that you mentioned too the cost to consumers, because that's a big issue that gets identified often by CEOs in terms of potential challenges when it comes to decarbonisation and reducing emissions. Because at the end of the day, the customer has to be willing to pay for whatever kind of energy it is, the greener energy that is being provided. And Hoda, I want to throw to you here, because there do seem to be so many competing energy sources at the moment. Just here we're talking about fully electric vehicles have come up, hydrogen electric, but at the end of the day, a lot of us still put gasoline in our cars. Fossil fuels are still prevailing. So how do we kind of view hydrogen in Canada's ambition to eventually be a net zero nation? Where does it fit in, do you think?
We should first of all, view hydrogen as a solution that complements direct electrification and biofuels in a net zero environment. So it's not the only solution, it's not the silver bullet point. It really complements other solutions. And hydrogen has undeniable potential to decarbonize the key sectors of economy, which are mostly energy intensive applications. So we should basically use it in right application. And the interesting fact about hydrogen is basically its versatility in terms of both supply and use. This means that as we move toward net zero nation, every province, they can tailor their approach to hydrogen production and usage based on the resource available in the province and the specific demand of their local market, which market really needs to be decarbonized. So if we put hydrogen in the right position, in in the right market with the right resources specific to each province, we can bring the cost down. Basically, we can make it happen earlier and in a larger scale.
Yeah, for sure. And, Billy, I'd like to get your take on that as well, because we hear about projects moving forward with Indigenous communities focused on geothermal, wind, solar, hydro. How do you think that Indigenous communities can kind of figure out where to focus and what might offer the biggest benefits when it comes to hydrogen? Is there a way to do that?
Yeah, Hoda has mentioned it several times, and it's the theme in this webcast is mix. There's competition, but there's also this larger energy strategy. And here again in Alberta, I think I've hit on it, and Edmonton in particular, we got the hydrogen hub. And Alberta is known for solar in the south and wind in the south, and of course our traditional oil and gas up north and throughout the province. And BC is known for some hydro, and Saskatchewan has more lakes than us, and Quebec has lots of hydro. And so Canada's a vast country. It has different amounts of resources in different places. Not everything works the same in every single place, but what works for us in Alberta is hydrogen going forward. And that's why we do have the Hydrogen Convention here with 70 countries just coming here the last month. And so the economic opportunity is $100 billion a year, and the corporate social responsibility net zero path and momentum is pushing us towards it. That's the hugest opportunity in Edmonton, in my opinion. And so, yes, we're doing some solar, yes, we're doing other things, but this represents the biggest opportunity for First Nations and, quite frankly, the Edmonton region to put us on that path of lowering carbon intensity for our region. And so, again, for First Nations, in particular, my biggest prediction is that yes, you'll see some more investment in natural gas in the Montney and up north, but over the next 10 years, I would say the IOC, Alberta Indigenous Opportunities Corporation, will be doing the biggest loans guarantees for hydrogen going forward in the long run for First Nations.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think that's going to be a huge program here in Alberta. And Dana, I want to go to you here because, we've kind of touched on this a little bit, but hydrogen, it's not new, right? Like it goes up and down, interest has waxed and waned over the years. They've been in Vancouver, I think they had a whole fleet of hydrogen buses and then kind of scrapped them going like, oh, it's too hard and too expensive. We can't do it. But why do we need hydrogen? And why do you think now, if indeed you do think this, which I think you do, considering our conversations we had earlier, but like, why is now a time for hydrogen? And why is it that now is a time that may actually get some impetus behind it as a fuel?
Well, I think the simple answer is that achieving Canada's net zero goals is a monumental undertaking. And it was said earlier, we're going to need every single tool in our toolkit to meet those goals, including low carbon hydrogen. But to get that required scale, we're also going to need efficient and cost-effective means of delivering that hydrogen. So Canada's gas system represents over 570,000 kilometers of pipeline and many billions of dollars of infrastructure that's been already built and has an essential role in achieving a net zero emissions future by 2050. And the gas system isn't optional in our clean energy future. It provides essential services that are required to get there. Services like delivering these low carbon fuels, providing large scale long-term energy storage that Hoda mentioned earlier, much more than what's possible with batteries, providing energy resiliency and reliability, also supporting the electric system during intense and prolonged cold weather events, for example. So I'd say, Emma, that we need hydrogen because it plays an increasingly important role in our decarbonized economy. And as for why now, well, quite frankly, I don't think we have any time to lose in making progress to our climate goals.
Yeah, for sure. Trevor, let me throw this to you because this does definitely apply to the trucking industry. How hopeful are you that it will indeed the commercial trucking industry, will adopt hydrogen in a large scale in the next few years? Is it a reality that you can actually see?
It is and it isn't. We need that fuel infrastructure that we talked about. We need, the price stability, the vehicles, the new technologies that are out there. They're not really cost effective compared to traditional diesel combustion engines. So, without the right incentives, the adoption for the early adopters is not going to happen. But we need to also build up that fuel supply at the same time. Eventually, this will become the norm, whether it's battery electric or hydrogen fuel cell electric. Conversion kits is a stepping stone to get there, and that's a lower cost way to help foster the adoption of hydrogen in commercial transportation. But it doesn't reduce emissions to zero. It's a stepping stone while we're waiting for these large OEMs, these large trucking manufacturers to roll these trucks off the line and not send them to California, but to send them up to Canada. And they got to be able to, prove themselves in Canadian winters and be able to pull Canadian weights. They're not designed for that at the moment. So there's some major challenges, but there's some bite-sized chunks and some stepping stones that we can take. So dual fuel, that hybrid solution is going to help us get there over the next 3 to 5 years. Building up small corridors and eventually making them larger with fuel stations, that's going to eventually help to foster the adoption. There's plenty of challenges. It all depends on getting some financial assistance from the government for the early adopters, to incentivize them, and then from there, hopefully, it becomes mainstream.
Yeah, for sure. Hoda, let me go to you. Trevor just spoke specifically about the trucking industry, but more broadly across the economic sectors, what do you think have been the biggest barriers to scaling hydrogen in Canada so far, and how do you think that they might be overcome?
Yeah. Basically, I can think of three main barriers in this space, but they are all overlap. The first one is the high production cost, especially for very low carbon hydrogen. Either we use electrolyzer or even fossil-based hydrogen, when we go over 90-95% carbon capture, is still expensive. The other barrier is the high investment risk. Producers, they hesitate to commit large investment without seeing an indication of market uptake. And on the other side, off-takers, they hesitate to commit to clean hydrogen contracts without certainty of reliable, long-term supply. So lacking offtake commitments, it could be a barrier, not just in Canada, like everywhere. The third barrier that I'm thinking of is the lack of infrastructure, especially the midstream infrastructure for cost-effective hydrogen delivery, because hydrogen delivery is a challenge. So, as Dana was mentioning, like blending hydrogen in the natural gas grid, or having like a just pipeline dedicated to hydrogen transport that could be twin pipelines, using like the same right of way. This could really help. And one solution that can address these three barriers, especially in the first phase of market development, as the panel is mentioning, is to aggregate regional demands, like hydrogen hub concept that was brought up here. In Alberta, it's happening. These hydrogen hub concepts, they like producers, off-takers, transporters, they can coordinate basically to aggregate and connect regional supply and demand. And this can enable, the widespread use of hydrogen in the very condensed geographical area. So government with hydrogen hub funding, they can mobilize, these efforts across the country. Other barriers like, lengthy permitting processes for projects, codes and standards that needs still to be developed. We need to address all these to enable the market to grow.
Yeah, for sure. And let me we're going to go to audience questions here in a soon. Apparently we have quite a few, which is great. Billy, I just want to go to you because before we had this event, you spoke about global interest in hydrogen. It's something we've all spoken about a little bit, but you attended a meeting in Ottawa, and I know you mentioned today about the hydrogen convention as well in Edmonton. But building on that, and with all of these emerging opportunities, what are your thoughts on the roadmap for Indigenous communities to participate in this economic opportunity? Oh, got Billy.
I said I wouldn't do that, and I did that.
Right, mate, I did it too. Here we
Yeah.
are.
Just to back up what Hoda was saying in terms of barriers really quick is, we use here, of course, Edmonton being known for traditional energy resources here in Canada. The stat we use is that we can produce hydrogen at about half the wholesale price of diesel, upgrading low cost natural gas. And so again, that carbon intensity and kind of that traditional industry of transitioning is already happening in Edmonton. So yes, cost is a barrier, initial investment is a barrier, but those risks are already being overcome by foreign direct investment and government working with those industries to do it at the cost of wholesale natural diesel. But going to the international question there, Emma, I recently attended prep for G7 that was just happening in Japan and advocating for Indigenous business across Canada in Ottawa with G7 partners, energy security for our G7 partners, and again, advocating for Indigenous nations across every energy sector, including the traditional ones. But every single country in the G7 that we talked to, be an ambassador or a trade investor, just wanted to talk about hydrogen. And that was a month ago. That was a month and a half ago in Ottawa. And I was a little bit taken back in that regard because, again, I thought they would want to talk about, maybe Indigenous inclusion. And they didn't have to be sold on that. They said, we understand that if you want to build big in Canada in the era of reconciliation, even though we're not Canadian citizens, we get that Indigenous communities need to be involved. You don't have to convince us of that. But we really want to know is, can you guys share technology with our hydrogen aspirations? And this is from the EU to the Pacific Coast, Japan and East Coast, the West Coast countries there. And for me, I got really excited because, again, we're talking about globalization. First Nations have been traditionally put in these small boxes across Canada, but now we're talking to big companies. And even Japan was really excited to say, like, did you know Mitsubishi has an Indigenous program that they look for foreign direct investment with Indigenous communities? And that was news to me. So again, hydrogen is kind of the catalyst for First Nations. We got our solar going. We got some of the other clean energy mixes going. But to me, especially in Alberta, in the hydrogen hub, you're going to see most of the investment, the big investment into hydrogen, maybe with Mitsubishi and some of the clean energy projects that they're doing there.
I had no idea about that with Mitsubishi as well. We've all learned something here today, mate. Thanks, Billy. I want to flip over to audience questions. As I say, we do have a fair few in the queue. Let me throw this first one to you, Dana, because we're kind of going full circle here. Early on, you talked about, the colours and noted that some people do not like them. But the IEA is proposing new hydrogen definitions to replace those colour labels and foster more transparency, which is something that you mentioned earlier. Do you think this is a welcome development in the sector? And what do you think it will actually mean for the energy landscape?
Absolutely, it would be a welcome development. Currently in British Columbia, our regulations enable FortisBC to acquire or produce green or waste hydrogen. Now, I think the industry as a whole would like to do away with colors, as you mentioned earlier, Emma, because we need to really, what problem are we trying to solve? If we're trying to solve for reducing the carbon content in the energy that Canadians use, we need to focus on the carbon intensity of production methods and use. So absolutely, we should be focusing on carbon intensity. And in British Columbia and Canada's hydrogen strategy, there's a recommended federal threshold of about 36.4 grams of carbon dioxide per megajoule. So that's about 40% of a greenhouse gas emissions reduction over, say, British Columbia's natural gas use. So what will it mean for the energy landscape? I think it will help bring more technologies and more lower carbon energy solutions to market. There's other options where we could be adding carbon dioxide, for example, back into hydrogen to make a form of synthetic methane that could be considered low carbon gas, but doesn't really fit our conventional definitions of renewable hydrogen, if you will, even if that hydrogen would be made from clean or electrolytic hydrogen.
Yeah, for sure. We've had a lot of questions about cost, and obviously this comes up. Everyone's always interested in the cost of things, as well they should be. And look, Trevor, let me ask you specifically here, and then if anyone else in the panel has any thoughts on the higher cost of producing hydrogen, I'm sure our guests, everyone, the audience would love to hear it. But Trevor, are you hearing like when hydrogen might be cost competitive to diesel, specifically in the transportation industry?
Yeah, we're looking at the pump price of $7 to $8 per kilo of hydrogen, and that's compressed hydrogen gas into the trucks right at the pump. If it's any higher than that, it's not going to be comparable to diesel. If it's lower than that, which I'm hoping, it'll have to be produced in mass and major infrastructure projects, to reduce those costs. We're talking about, a production facility, pumping out, 80 tons a day of hydrogen to get it down to a price that's similar, and then pumped on site. So whether that could actually happen, that's to be seen, and that's for the major players who are investing these large amounts, like Chief Billy referred to, the Air Liquides and the Air Products, sorry, and others, to make sure if they're producing in mass volume, we might get to, diesel comparative. But until then, it's going to be hard to get there without some federal and provincial assistance.
Yeah, I was going to ask you about, yeah, you've mentioned that, and a few different panelists have mentioned that idea of government support, specifically when it comes to transportation. Like, how important is that? How big a chunk of the pie do you think they need to come to the table here?
Well, there's of the $30 million in projects that I currently manage, government kicks in about 50%. Our project partners, and we have, probably about 30 of them now, they all kick in a portion of money to be a part of these projects and to help build these products. So building these two trucks, this cost is between 17.5 and $18.5 million at the moment. And they're prototype trucks, a lot of engineering drawings, go into that. But we were lucky enough to get some, funding assistance from Emissions Reductions Alberta to, get this project underway. Hopefully there's some additional incentives for the commercial transportation industry, where government can, contribute that 50%, help to nullify that initial investment and de-risk the situation, so that our carrier members can make those capital decisions to go and invest in these new technologies and alternative fuels.
Yeah. Okay. Very. Yeah.
Just to add on to what Trevor's saying too, is we often think about, the provincial and federal governments of helping with the subsidies and getting things off the ground, and that really is the case. But again, here in Edmonton, the city has a big role to play, and Trevor's referred to it. Sometimes we refer to it as creating that market, and 40% of the Edmonton fleet for public buses is coming up for. They're going to age out within the next 5 years, and it just coincides, of course, with that 5,000 vehicle challenge here in Edmonton. So cities have to step up in that public transportation aspect regard, and Edmonton has a few pilot buses already going, and so it's already happening here. But we're going to have to outweigh the risks of moving that forward with 40% of the fleet coming up in 5 years. But it's on its way.
Right. It's like all technologies have to come on board. I guess all different, levels of government and people have to come on board as well, I suppose. We talked a little bit about cost there. I want to go to safety, and Hoda, you might be able to jump in here, but we're getting a lot of audience questions, and this does come up whenever I have discussions about hydrogen with pretty much anyone. Like, when it comes to safety in hydrogen, what considerations are there around storage, production, and fueling, and like, can it be transported safely, and how do people need to be educated to even accept hydrogen as part of the energy mix, do you think, Hoda?
I want just a little bit talk about the safety concerns first. Hydrogen is a non-toxic gas, but it has high flame velocity. It has broad ignition range and low ignition, and at the same time low ignition energy. It makes it highly flammable gas. So this is partly mitigated by its high buoyancy and diffusivity, which it basically causes it to dissipate quickly. The flame can dissipate very quickly. but it has a flame that is not visible to naked eye, and it's color, and being like colorless, odorless, it makes it harder for people to detect fire and leaks. But having like codes and standards, the codes and standards are being developed everywhere. So this is not something that we can say like it's not manageable. It is manageable with right codes and standards being in place, and as it's like managed for other fuels. We know that hydrogen has its own considerations, but right codes and standards that it's now being developed, it can really like help, and it can help hydrogen to be safely deployed, in all the applications, I can say. So there is like a lot of consideration on that part. It should be like even more than other fuels, but this doesn't mean that there's not a solution. And I mentioned that like right codes and standards can solve this problem easily.
Yeah, for sure. I want to maybe throw this question to you, Dana. Actually, Canada does have this kind of, and so does Alberta, actually, a hydrogen strategy. But because hydrogen is so kind of widely available all over the world, and Australia is massive on it, lots of countries are putting a lot of money into trying to develop hydrogen and get a foot into this market. So how do you think Canada can gain a competitive advantage? Because sometimes we're not the quickest necessarily of taking advantage of opportunities that are presented to us in an economic sense.
Sure. I think Canada's competitive advantage really lies in the fact that we have all the natural resources required to make several of these types of low carbon hydrogens, from natural gas, carbon geological storage for the carbon, water, and of course, lots of clean electricity. The electricity cost is one of the highest cost inputs to electrolytic hydrogen. So the fact that Canada has a lot of clean electricity is certainly beneficial. The other thing is that Canada already has a lot of technology companies working in this space on a global level. And finally, I think also Canada has the people with the technical skills and expertise required to help us achieve this vision of hydrogen.
Yeah, for sure. Billy, actually, let me throw this one to you because someone specifically has asked, and it's a good question. Will Indigenous communities have an equity stake in these projects? Because that's a really important part of economic reconciliation as well.
So I've touched on it a few times, and I highlighted it as an add-on to Dana's answer, which is the strategic advantage. Indigenous communities have often seen as being a big part of the regulatory regime that's maybe prohibitive to developing these large-scale projects. And quite frankly, it's the opposite. It's the opposite when you talk equity and you talk ownership. And again, here in Alberta, that's happening through government-backed loan guarantees. And when I went to the G7, they said we would absolutely welcome Indigenous ownership. And from an internal Indigenous perspective on the First Nations, on Métis communities, I witnessed it every day in some of the projects that I'm involved in. Is yes, we've had historical differences, but we're now at the ownership table, and can we actually make this regulatory review way more efficient than it actually is? And I think that's Canada's challenge, right? Is I hear it from private sector and other countries is Canada's awesome. We still want to invest there. We see them as stable, secure, and a great country to do business. But sometimes the regulatory regime is a little bit too long. And again, Indigenous communities need to flip that and be a part of the regulatory regime to make it more effective. And I think you'll see that over the coming years.
Yeah, that is often a discussion point that comes up, is that it does take a really long time to get projects done in Canada, right? To get shovels in the ground and get approvals done. So when you have a new and burgeoning economic opportunity, perhaps it would work better if you just kind of give her, as it were, and get at it. We had a question about hydrogen as it relates to ammonia, specifically production and transportation, because these two do often get lumped in together. Hoda, this might be something in your realm here, if you can potentially take that question for us.
Sure. Yeah. Ammonia. It's hard to basically transport pure hydrogen. Ammonia is one of the solution that it helps us to bring down the cost, and we can take like large scale hydrogen like in ammonia form and transport it, and then in the destination, whether it's like it's like works great for the export market because like Canada has a great advantage of producing green hydrogen and export it as an ammonia, because if you want to export hydrogen in a compressed form, like gaseous form, or even liquid form, you can just transport a little bit of it, and it's like it's like adds the cost significantly. But ammonia is a good example of like converting hydrogen to another substance, which is like you can transport them with big ships, ammonia all over the world, basically. And it's better in terms of like efficiency loss. It's better to use ammonia as is, not to convert it back to hydrogen and in the destination. But if there is no other choice in the destination, because there are like lots of destinations that they really don't have access to resources to produce hydrogen. So whether it because everyone is like talking about low efficiency, whether there's in the cases that we have no choice, actually even converting it back to hydrogen in the destination and use pure hydrogen makes sense for some countries. So ammonia, I can say, is a great choice for the for long distance and export markets to basically target lowest possible cost for transportation.
For sure. And now, Hoda, I'm going to ask you some questions here that we've had some people asking, and they're very, very basic questions about hydrogen itself, because you know what? It's something that we didn't really cover here. So apologies, audience. A couple of the questions. A, what are the raw ingredients for hydrogen? And B, how exactly is it produced? Like, how do you make this stuff?
Yeah, sure. Hydrogen can be made from fossil fuel. It's already been used in, as I mentioned, in the Canada industry. We use hydrogen as a feedstock in oil refining. We are now using it to produce ammonia for agriculture. We are using it to produce methanol. So it's basically out of natural gas, out of coal, any hydrocarbon that has hydrogen within it. It can be gasified, it can be reformed, using steam as a catalyst. You can reform hydrogen fossil fuel like methane to produce hydrogen. But the problem with this pathway is that you're also producing CO2 that you have to capture it somehow. There's another way that Dana was mentioning, pyrolysis. You're basically using fossil fuel, like using methane, but using like a catalyst, and at a very high temperature, you're cracking the methane. You're basically cracking methane to hydrogen and solid carbon, that the solid carbon has its own market. And there are other ways of making hydrogen. We call it like electrolyzer. Electrolyzer, basically, they are splitting water into hydrogen and oxygen. You use electricity and you use water, and you split water into hydrogen and oxygen. These electrolyzers, there are different types of electrolyzer. Alkaline electrolyzers, proton exchange membranes, like there are very high temperature electrolyzer. We call it solid oxide electrolyzers, and that nuclear energy that we haven't covered it here, but it's a way to produce high temperatures and make use of like high temperature electrolyzer, because they have higher efficiency. So there are like lots of ways to produce hydrogen. I should mention here that we are also basically, we have in Canada chemical industries that they have hydrogen as their byproducts. We have chemical industries in Prince George, in North Vancouver, that the companies now, they are making use of this byproduct hydrogen, that it's like just wasted to air, and just capture it, purify it, and use it for transportation or other applications.
Thanks for going through that for us. I do appreciate it. Just one last audience question we have time for, and then we're going to have to wrap up. But Trevor, what reactions or questions are you getting from members here? Because this would be quite a big change for the transportation industry.
It absolutely is. Of the truck drivers who have gotten the privilege to drive these hydrogen fuel cell trucks, these 30-year-old, old school veterans of truck driving. It's like they just went to Disneyland. The trucks are so quiet, have so much power, so much torque. They have grins from ear to ear. They're absolutely loving the new technology. Whether their bosses will buy it for them is the next question.
What's the next question? Will the bosses get it for me? I'd really like to close out with a quick lightning round. I'm not sure if we have time for it, but you know what? If each of you just came away with a thought today or a final key takeaway for like 10 seconds that our audience can go away with. Let's start with you, Dana.
Sure. I suppose I'd simply say that low carbon gases like hydrogen are going to be an important cornerstone in our clean energy economy. And they're also one of the most expedient ways to achieve rapid decarbonization.
Fantastic. Hoda, final thoughts?
If we strategically apply hydrogen in the right sector, it has undeniable potential to drive transformative changes to our economy.
And Trevor, any thoughts from you, mate?
Well, we're going to try and foster hydrogen adoption, and we're starting with demonstrations and pilots, and we're going to keep progressing with the new technologies and try out everything we possibly can to help achieve Canada's zero emission targets.
For sure. And Billy?
To meet the carbon intensity aspirations of Canada, hydrogen as a mix is going to be one of the foundational mixes, and here in Alberta, carbon capture utilization is going to make it happen.
All tools in the toolbox. Hey, right. Unfortunately, we are out of time, so we have to leave it there. But Dana, Trevor, Hoda, and Billy, thank you so much for joining us today. We really do appreciate it. And thank you to our audience as well. You had some great questions. Thanks for listening in and taking the time. And on behalf of the Globe and Mail, thanks to FortisBC for making today's event possible. And everyone who registered for today's webcast will receive a link to re-watch this fantastic recording in about 2 weeks, so you can take in all it. Perhaps you didn't have time to make notes earlier. Thank you again, everyone, and have a wonderful rest of your day.
Thank you.
Thanks.